Okay,
in this tutorial, I want to introduce you to using Audacity for doing audio editing. Audacity is just one program that is good for doing audio editing. Another one that we have access to is Adobe Audition. But I thought we'd use Audacity since it's nice and easy to use, but also you can download it at home for free, and you can make use of it there as well. So I'm assuming that you've downloaded it to your computer. I've got it here with an icon. If you haven't downloaded it, I've left separate instructions or a separate tutorial on how to download Audacity to the school desktops. And if you don't have an icon there, then just go down to your Start button down in the bottom left corner of your desktop and find it in your list. So I'm going to start up Audacity here.
Somebody who was just
so when it opens up, this is what it's going to look like. I'm not sure if I've got the exact same version as you do. This is what you'll have if you download it at home. I'm not sure if the school computers have a slightly different version. If so, there might be some slight changes in the way the screen looks, but it wouldn't be very much, so you should be able to work your way around. If we take a look at it, we've got our menu bar along the top. Then we've got these controls here for things like play, stop, and record. We've got some tools in here that will be very useful to us, and some tools over here that will be useful. In this area here, we've got, if you were working from home and you had an external microphone, you would plug it into your computer and select it here, or you would want to select your internal computer microphone if you had that, particularly if you have a laptop. And you can also select what speakers you want to use as well. So, and then this blue area is where we're really going to put our project together, and it's going to be, we're going to have tracks in here. Tracks are, I kind of think of it a little bit like layers in other programs. They're slightly different. But each audio piece that we bring in here will be put onto a separate track. And so, actually what I'll do is, I'll just show you very quickly. If I wanted to record something, I could just click on the red button here and start recording. And as I record, we'll see that it records my voice. I'm going to click the stop button there. And notice that it created a track for me. I also could have gone up here to track and gone add new track, and I can decide whether I want it to be mono or stereo. Usually you're going to want it to be stereo. Mono means it says if you only have one speaker. Stereo, you have a left and right speaker. So over in this area, we've got some things. We can change the left and right balance. So if you want it to be more on the left speaker versus the right speaker, and so on. And right in this area here, we've got, it says dB, that's decibels. That's the gain. So we can increase the gain, which some people think of as volume. So we can make something louder by increasing the gain here, or make it less loud. So I'm just going to undo that, and then Control Z until I get rid of that track. Let's go ahead and bring in the files that you've downloaded. So I'm hoping that as you go through this tutorial, you will work through it with me. And so you should have downloaded these two files, and you should have gone through and made up a folder. So if you go to your desktop, go to your class folder, and then you should make up a new folder called audio editing. Double click into it, make a new folder. Alright, so we're going to click on this yellow button, create new folder, and we'll call it First Aud. That's going to be our first Audacity project. For every new project that you do, make sure that you create a new folder for it within the audio editing folder. This is really important. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's really important because you will see, I'm going to double click in here for right now. I brought in those two files, so you should be doing the same thing. And later on, what I'm going to show you is there's going to be an Audacity file, and then also a folder that it makes up on its own, and it needs that folder. So it's important that you have this in a separate project folder. So I'm just going to minimize that for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, and File, Save Project, Save Project As. I'm going to say OK. Again, I'm assuming now that you've already created this folder within the audio editing folder. If not, work your way through and use this to make up an audio editing folder, and then your First Aud folder. And now I'm going to call this one First Aud. F-I-R-S-E space A-U-D, and then you can put your name at the end of that, so it is obvious that it's yours. And then we're going to say save.
That's what it was there for.
And now I'm just going to have a quick look. As soon as I do that, notice that in that same folder, I've got, there's my file. that's my Audacity file, and here is this folder that is created all on its own. I didn't create that, it created it itself. And if I was to take this file right here, this .aup, which is the Audacity file, if I was to take that and put it on another computer, I wouldn't be able to open up the Audacity file. It would tell me that it's got errors, because it would also have to have this folder with it. So it's really important, again, to make sure that you're doing file management here. Otherwise, it's just going to go badly for you. This Audacity file, again, could only be opened up by somebody with Audacity. So we're going to eventually export to an MP3 file. But you always want to save it as an Audacity file first, so that you can open up and continue editing if you want to. Now we're going to go, and instead of creating voiceover by recording it, I thought we'd put one in. So let's go to File, Open. Let's go with Lindsay and me and say open.
And the bird was so close and they sing
so
very loud.
What would be really useful for this is just think back to things like your video projects and your animation projects. But you probably had times when you had audio that just wasn't quite the right level, or wasn't clear, all sorts of things. And you could easily use Audacity to clean up the audio and make it much more clear for your other project. So for this one, what I've done was it's just myself talking and my daughter talking, and you'll find that when I play it, my voice is much louder than my daughter's. So I'm just going to play this.
Beautiful bird.
I'm here with my daughter, Lindsay. How old are you, Lindsay? 17. And what grade are you in?
The bull.
And what are you going to do next? You can see that the audio from me is really okay, but the audio from my daughter is really, really low. If we were to just go and use that in another project, well, it just wouldn't sound very good. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people do, is they just we don't have to, because we've got the ability to edit. So here what I could do is I could increase the gain here, and I could play it. I'm here with my daughter, Lindsay. How old are you, Lindsay? 17. And what grade are you? So that works to an extent, except for that now it still seems as if my voice is much, much louder than my daughter's. And it would be nice to be able to make it so that they were more similar. So what we're going to do is we'll work our way through there and do a little bit of cleanup on that. Okay, so I'm going to put the gain back where it was. And so now we've got these tools up in here. We've got this one. This is the selection tool. We can use that for all sorts of things. We can select a portion. Maybe I don't want that beginning portion. I can select it and delete it. I'm going to Control Z to undo. I could also use the scissors over here to cut it. The nice thing about doing that is then I could just, if I wanted to put it back in somewhere, I could just paste it back in again. Okay, and I'm just going to Control Z and put it back again. And then we could also move things around, so we can use this tool here, and we can now move the audio. Maybe I want to slide it over, or maybe I'm going to add some other tracks in down below that would start first, so I can move this around. And notice also along here that we've got our timeline. So this is in seconds. So here's 0 seconds, and then 1 second, 2 seconds, and so on. So we can zoom in on the timeline using this one. I could go along here and select a portion and zoom in on it. And to zoom out, we can, I think the easiest way is just to go back up to view and go to zoom and say normal.
It's in German.
And now we're back to where we were. So now, one of the things I like about this is we can go ahead and select a portion of it and put it on a separate track. So I'm going to go back to my selection tool. And this time I'm going to select just the portion that is Lindsay talking. That's this bit here. And I'm going to go up to edit. And now there's different things that we can do. I could do a split cut and remove a portion of it. I could do this down here, clip that boundary. I could say split. Now let's split that into, this whole thing is now actually 3 different clips. I could go up to my move tool now and move this one over, and then move this one over. However, I can't move them out of order now. They're still in their order. I can just move them independently now. Although the nice thing is I could go ahead and delete or do something else to just that one portion. However, I'm just going to Control Z again
check them out, and only a proportion.
So I'm going to fairly quickly. You pause and rewind if you need to, so that you can keep up. But I want to try to keep the video not too long. So I'm going to Control Z until I've completely gotten that back to where it was. Oh, so I went one too far. So I'm just going to go up to Edit, Redo. And now, again, I'm going to go up to Edit, and I'm going to go down to Click Boundaries again, and I'm going to say Split New.
It was fantastic.
And notice that what it did was it took the selection that I had and it put it on the new track down below. So these are the tracks.
A three-singer.
I can scroll down to each one. I can also use if I go near the bottom of a track, I can scroll it up and make it, and zoom it up a little bit in the vertical direction, so that I can see them easier. And now, the nice thing about this is, I can now work with this track independently. So I can now increase the gain here on Lindsay's voice. So now, if we go back, I can go up and hit play, and it's going to continue playing from wherever it is. Or I can actually just click anywhere in the timeline. So I'm actually going to click somewhere along here. And you'll say, starts playing. What grade are you, Lindsay? 17. And what grade are you in? Okay, so not bad. Maybe even just a little bit louder. I'm going to go back and play it again. I'm here with my daughter, Lindsay. How old are you, Lindsay? 17. And what grade are you in? 3. Okay, so you can tell that that part now is actually pretty good. So we've cleaned that up quite a ways. And so now there's more audio of Lindsay over here. So again, I'm going to go over to my selection tool, and I'm going to select that portion. And I'm going to go over to Edit again, go down to Click Boundaries, Split New, and notice that it put that on yet another track. So I can now play with that separately. But the thing is, in this case, I actually want all of Lindsay's to go up, have the gain increase the same amount on for all of it. And any changes that I want to make to her voice, I want it to be affecting all of them rather than having to do it on several tracks. What I can do now is I can actually just go to the Move tool, and instead of sliding it left or right, which I could do, I can actually slide it up to the next track. And once if you get the track close to the joining point of the track above it, it'll actually snap and line it up. So if we were to play this right now, it would be as if the whole audio was not broken apart at all. It would just be as if it was all one line. It's just that this track plays and this track plays. So now again, I'm going to click close to it and visit it. And what grade are you in? Okay, and I won't bother carrying on with the next parts. That's showing you how you can modify the voice, and this could be so useful in if you think back to some of the audio on some of the videos that were taken for a previous project. We might have somebody that's talking low. We could increase the gain by bringing it into Audacity, or maybe one person is their audio is fine, but another person is speaking quite quiet, and so we can go ahead and change it as well. And so this can be really useful. There's lots of other things you can do with this as well. Oh, I just want to show you. So now we've got this track over here. There's different things you can do with tracks. One thing I can do is click on the X, and I can move it.
Unscrupulous canary.
So that's gotten rid of that track. I can also mute a track, so maybe I didn't want to hear this track while I'm playing this one. So if I had some music underneath, I'd maybe want to mute the music track while I'm editing the dialogue. So I'm just going to now play that.
Amazing stuff. Here's a
so now that's not playing because I muted it. We can also do something. And there's a few other things that we can do, but let's leave that for now. So, the next thing I want to show you is how to bring in some music or set notes in process. I'm going to go down to the file and say Save Project right now, just in case. I should be saving pretty regularly, just in case. And say Save.
That's why if you have
So now let's go ahead and put in some music. So we're going to go up to File, Import, Audio, and this time we're bringing in Elton John's Crocodile Rock. I'm just going to double click on it there. It's going to put it in on another track. And there it is. And let's scroll that up a bit so that we can see all the tracks together.
Because we can find the secret of how you make new
Okay, so now we can see them all. Here's the Elton John. Just so that you do know, this one here is called Lindsay and Me, and this one is called Lindsay and Me. You can always just click on it and rename it.
Long name,
so I won't bother just right now, but it certainly is going to be useful to you to not always have, not just leave them if you don't have a lot of tracks and need to figure out which one is which. But now, let's look here, we've got our music in here. So now if I go ahead and play it.
Bottom of ponds.
So now we can hear the voiceover over top of the music. But let's say that we wanted to get rid of the beginning portion. We could just select it, and we could use the or hit delete.
I've seen the evidence. You know, it was a little woodcut from the 1550s. I know it's true.
And now what we could do is we could also, maybe we, in this case, want to have the voiceover further over in the song. So we could go ahead and select it. We can select each track separately, but I think we can actually, if I left click with my mouse and drag over the top two tracks there, then I can go to my move key, or it's actually called the time shift key, but I call it the move key. Now I can slide those over, and they'll slide together, and we'll just put them somewhere in the middle of the song. Well, actually, I'll just put them about there to put 30 seconds. And now, really what you want to have happen here is you want the music to dip in volume during the voiceover. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use this tool up here. It's called the envelope tool. And I'm going to come back down, and I'm going to go to the track with Elton John on it. And you know, at first I'm just going to zoom in just to try to make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to use the zoom tool, and I'm going to select that area, and then I'll zoom in just over that area, make it just a tiny bit easier to work with. I'm going to go to my zoom tool, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to click on the Elton John track, and notice it puts in these white dots, and those are grips just like in any other program. And now I could left click and drag down, and that would decrease the volume or the gain. I'm going to put them back where they were, and so we want to have the volume up at that point. But just a little further on, I'm going to click again, and I get a new set of envelopes, and so now I could drag those down.
So expect
take it down quite a ways, and then I'm going to come over a little bit further, and I'm going to click again to put in another set of envelopes. I'm going to try to keep that at about the same level as the ones just beside it.
Other than testes. So in birds, the testes are in the bottom.
Somehow not getting that very well, so I'm going to Control Z.
And these structures here,
and I'm going to put in another set again,
which in human males are wrapped round the tail.
And then I'm going to put in another set and bring the volume back up again.
These are huge.
So,
and just to put it in kind of human.
Bring that up, and here I'm going to bring this one just down a little bit so that it stays at about the same. So now it goes down the volume, goes across at about the same, and goes back up again. And let's just see how that plays right there.
Blackbird's.
Here with my daughter, Lindsay. Hello, lady Lindsay. And we're bringing it again. You'll see that you hear that the volume goes back up again. I think to really make this good, I really want to take this down even further.
Pairs and the large testes.
Way down so that you'll only just barely hear it in the background during the voiceover.
Are not promiscuous.
Now, play it one more time.
Ever might have the answer to that. And I asked my ornithological.
I'm here with my daughter, Lindsay. Hello, lady Lindsay. And that sounds pretty good. So now, again, you can just play around with those kinds of things. But you can see that can be really useful. Now you can drop the music down during voiceovers and then take it back up again and all sorts of things. And just to finish off here, there are some things that I'm not going to bother to show you. There's lots of things that you can do in here. Things that you can do, such as removing background noise. Background noise would be things like if you had a fan running, or in our classroom quite often when the construction room dust collector goes on, we can hear it in the classroom and you just get a hum in the background. You can actually, if you get in the habit of when you record your voiceovers, always recording a little bit with just the background noise, so start a little early or finish a little late after you've done your voiceover, then you'll be able to, when you bring it into Audacity, you'll be able to isolate that background noise, and you'll be able to take it out throughout the entire audio track, and so that can be really useful to you, and as far as cleaning it up and making it sound more professional. Another thing that you can do do is to play around with different things in here. We've gone through the menus, the edit menu, select. Don't really use that too much. View you use for zoom. This one, transport, we haven't really used. Tracks, you can add new tracks in. I don't use that very much. Generate, you can actually generate black noise and so on. But this is the one that you're going to want to play around with, is the effects. There's a lot of effects in here that you can play with. You could add in distortion, you could put in some reverb, you could put in echo, all sorts of things that you can do in here. And the best way to get to know how to use them is just to play around with them and see what they do, whether you like the effect or not. But one of the things that we're going to play around with just to show you is how to change the pitch. So we can change pitch here.
South America.
And so what I'm going to do, let's just say that if you want to make your voice sound different, I'm going to do it on my voice right here. So I'm going to go back up to the selection tool, and I'll just change just this portion of the track, and we'll go up to effect, and we'll go down to change pitch. I can change the pitch by changing using this slider bar. If I increase the pitch, then it's going to make my voice higher. It's going to make it almost like a chipmunk.
Brazil in South America.
And if I take it down a little bit, then
always revealed
we can make it much deeper. And you can just play around with it. I'm just going to put it back about where it was.
You can see how the artist must have gone, nothing about birds. What the hell?
And I'll just go about there. There's also these ones up here. I'm not going to deal with what the Fs and F sharps and things are. But let's just say that I'm just going to put these both to enough to begin with.
And up until
and whatever the number is here, just leave it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from an F on one, go to say one of these. I'm just selecting one. And let's just preview and see what the change is. It should make it right there. Okay, and if I take this back down, then I'll get a deep voice again.
Some people like
Lindsay, hello. So different ways to play around with it, and you can play with any of these, and it just gives you different ways to make changes in there. I'm going to cancel that one. If you want to save that change in there, then you'd have to say OK. The speed is very similar. If I go to change speed, then here right now the speed multiplier is just a 1% change. I'm just going to make that like a 25% change, so now it's 1.25. And I'm going to do a preview. That'll be Lindsay. It's very much like increasing the pitch, so increasing the speed will raise your voice, and if I take it down to less than 1, so if I went to say 80%, then it would deepen the voice again. One thing to watch for though, it will actually change the length that it is on the timeline. So if you line that up with something in an animation or something like that, then just think about what that's going to do, because it's actually going to change the length of time that audio takes up. So I'm just going to cancel that one as well. And that's just about where we want to end. I'll also put in the later tutorial, the one that has how to do background noise removal. I'll put in a tutorial that will show you how to do some basic things that will actually, for a voiceover, they're worthwhile doing almost every time. It'll really crispen up your voiceover, make your voice sound much more professional. So rather than just taking what you get out of the microphone. So I'll put that in there later for you. And so now we're pretty much done with this thing. So you would go up to File, Save Project again.
That to future generations.
And then you always want to make sure that you save your project, because if you don't, you just export this thing, then you wouldn't be able to come in and say, well, you know what, I like everything except I just want to change one small thing and start to edit it again. So you want to make sure that you save the Audacity project. I'm also going to go now and say export, because I do want to export it as an MP3. That way you can build it into Premiere Pro or Audacity, or into Adobe Animate, or even just use it as an MP3 file if you were editing some music and you wanted to make an MP3 file out of it. The other one sometimes you may want to use is a WAV file, but probably most often you're going to export it as an MP3. So I'm going to click on that, and then you want to navigate and make sure that you're saving it into your first odd folder, and I'm going to make it called first odd, and then you can put your name after that, .mp3, and of course it'll put in the .mp3 for you. I will of changing the red things down here. I'm just going to say save. And then it's going to say the tracks will be mixed down and exported as one stereo file. So just the same as this Crocodile Elton John's song file came in as one track. Well, and the voiceover that we had was one track. This will all now go down to one track. But if you brought it into Audacity again, the MP3 file again, it would just be one track with everything all mixed together. So I'm going to say OK. And this comes up, this is almost like the DVD information, or if you were going to maybe do some editing to some music and then you wanted to play it on an MP3 player or your iPod or something like that, and you can use them anymore on your phone, then this is where it would get the information about the artist, etc. Is right here. So I just get rid of all this for right now. I don't think we need it for this kind of stuff. We're going to say OK.
Night out on the town or something like that.
And then now it goes through and it exports the file.
The third,
and once it's done, we'll have an MP3, which then you could open up and play separately. So it's almost done there.
Title of his book is
so I'm going to go to my
Man and Selection
Explorer again, and go to my...
Just take that word out. Luckily, Darwin stuck to his guns. The fourth...
And there's my first odd.mp3 file. So notice here's my first .aup. There's that folder it made up all on its own. There's the original files that I used. And if I double click on this one, then it'll open up and play all on its own. Here with my daughter, Lindsay. Hello, Lindsay. Sounds now as an MP3 file. So I hope that gets you started with Audacity, and I hope you realize that it's actually pretty easy and pretty fun to make use of. So what I'd like you to do now is to put together a project where you do your own voiceovers and put in some music and sound effects and do some editing and come up with a good final product. So have some fun with it, and I hope you enjoy Audacity.
Original manuscript, I mean, it's got her red crayon through it, and then there's the published version where those lines don't appear. And you get a sense of what Darwin was up against with Etty when you realise that in later life, single-handedly, she started a campaign to have one particular fungus removed from the British countryside because she thought this would be a bad influence on the maids. Now, if you or I were going to remove Phallus imputicus, is its fabulous scientific name, if you were going to remove this from the countryside, I think what you'd do is you'd walk around, you'd smell it first, it's called the stinkhorn, and I think I would just squash it with my foot, but Etty didn't do that. She picked them up, she handled them, and she brought them back in a basket covered in a napkin, and she burnt them in the privacy of her own study. You know, Darwin, there was no chance he was ever going to talk about promiscuity. And on that note, I'll finish. And as time went on, I became increasingly fascinated by the question of how we know what we know about birds. So if somebody took you on a bird walk and you heard a bird singing and they say, well, it's defending its territory. How do we know it's defending its territory? Where did that knowledge come from? And so a few years ago, I decided I'd try and find out where that knowledge of birds came from. And of course, the obvious place to start was in libraries. And when you started to look at the history of what we know about birds, it went back a long way. It went back to the Greeks, basically, Aristotle and so on. But things didn't really start happening in Europe until about 1500. And the thing that amazed me about these old books, and some of them are in libraries, mainly in the valuable section of the library, so you can't get easy access, but also a few nutters have fabulous collections of books, and if you treat them right, they're very proud to show you their fantastic collections. And this is one owned by Lord Derby at Knowsley Hall. And when I started looking inside these books, I began to realise that a lot of these collections were of books like this, where there were fabulous illustrations, but nobody ever read the text. Nobody had looked at what these early writers about birds had done. The first thing that struck me when I started reading was that most of our early knowledge of birds came from keeping birds. Now this is a big no-no today. The RSPB have successfully brainwashed us into thinking anything to do with keeping birds is wrong. You can't even think about keeping birds. You can't even think about what people did in the past about keeping birds. And so it's kind of been obliterated from our kind of collective consciousness. But in fact, the history of ornithology in terms of keeping birds is just an amazingly rich vein of stuff. And one of the things that happened to me was, as I got more and more into this, it's just a complete pain in the bum to continually be going to Oxford or Cambridge to get access to those rare books. You can just click on Bookfinder or something. I started to buy them. I never told my wife I was spending all our money on this. And then, you know, once you start buying them, people say, have you seen such and such is for sale? And you go and look at the price. Ooh, right, okay, click, and off you go. And then people started going to auctions for me, and I'd made lists of what I wanted. And on one occasion, the guy went to an auction for me, and months later this package arrived in the post, and I went through the books, and I kind of vaguely remembered ordering this one and this one. And then this book, Trait de Rossignol, Treatise on a Nightingale, was in amongst the books that were sent. And I went, oh, no recollection, I don't even know this book. And I looked it up, and it was an incredibly scarce book, and it was 30 quid, you know. It was incredibly rare. It's written in 1707. And to add insult, injury to insult, I can't even read French, so it was kind of completely useless. But luckily, I'd got a good batch of international PhD students, and I got this girl to start translating it. And as she translated, I realised that this book was a kind of turning point in the history of ornithology. It was an absolute goldmine of knowledge. Nightingales were the most popular cage bird. They have this fabulous song, and this is in the days before iPods and iPhones, and people kept birds in their houses as a kind of medieval radio. That's what it was there for. And the nightingale, you know, is the ultimate songster. I don't know if you can crank that up a bit. One of my most poignant memories was one of my PhD students, his parents were very grateful for him getting a PhD. They must have thought, like me, he was a bit of a loser, and he made it. And they invited me and my wife to Italy as a kind of thank you. And part of this trip was to go to the island of Giglio, which is just south of Elba. And we stayed in a little bed and breakfast place, you know, on a wooded hillside, an exquisitely beautiful place. We arrived there at dusk, and the plan was to go over to Giglio the next day. And as I got into bed, there was a nightingale in the garden, and it was closer than you are now, and it started singing like that. And in contrast to last night, this thing kept me awake. This thing kept me awake in a state of euphoria for the whole night. And the song was so powerful, and the bird was so close, and they sing very loud, I could feel it in my chest. And I kind of drifted in and out of sleep while this bird was singing. It's an unpaired male. It's only the unpaired males that sing at night. It was singing for its partner. And it was just the most fantastic experience ever. Because people kept birds principally for their song, careful observers started to notice really interesting things about bird song. And all sorts of birds were kept. Sometimes, like the bullfinch, they were kept principally for their appearance. This is one of Britain's most beautiful birds. I don't think we need this spider here. But the bullfinch, I can find the mouse on here, has probably the worst song of any bird at all. So here it is.
Bullfinch.
You have to get this bit on the tape. That's not me. Listen, listen. That's it. That's the bullfinch's song, okay? It's been likened to a squeaky wheelbarrow. But there's something very strange and very special about the bullfinch. Somebody earlier asked me what my favourite bird is. The bullfinch is my favourite bird, without doubt. In the 1850s, and this had been known for the previous 300 years, people kept bullfinches because, despite that awful song, they have the most remarkable facility for learning songs that they hear. And there was a little industry amongst the foresters in Germany of taking nestling bullfinches, hand-rearing them, and then a forester would whistle a particular tune to them, and the bird would learn it. And there would be things like this, "Thou art so like a flower." I can't whistle that, but that's the kind of thing they did. And prior to that, people had also recognized that if you played them a tune on a flageolet like this, they could learn it as well. So here's a friend of mine playing that. Well, not that piece of music, another piece of music. And there was a very popular book full of flageolet music like this, specifically for you to train your bird. It was a complete scam. There was no way a bird could ever learn anything as complicated as that. But this is what they could learn. So this first recording I'm going to play you is of a German forester whistling the tune he wants his bullfinch to learn. It's in German. So this is somebody telling the German guy to whistle it. So he goes. Okay, so enough of that. Oops, hang on. And now this is the bird singing it, whistling it. The amazing thing is the bird just does it so much better. And you also probably notice the bird always shifts it up a semitone. Nobody knows why they do it at all. A really good bird, and it's only the males, so this was a desperately unprofitable business. You'd start off with a bunch of chicks, you'd hand rear them, you'd whistle to them 15 times a day for 6 months. It was not easy work. Half of them would be females, they would be rubbish, you'd chuck them out, and only a proportion of the males would learn the song. And a very small number could sing 3 of those kind of tunes. Not only that, I mean, these birds became incredibly popular. Queen Victoria had one, the Russian Tsar had one, and the Victorian supermodel Lizzie Siddle had one. Everybody, you know, it's like having an iPod today. It was a great status symbol to have one of these birds, and if it could sing 3 folk songs, it was fantastic. Not only were these birds amazing at repeating these songs, and if you had a 3-singer, it would cost you about 5,000 quid in today's money. Phenomenally expensive. Not only that, these birds formed the most remarkable relationship with their owner. So this guy is Jürgen Nicolai, who was a German ornithologist who worked with Konrad Lorenz in the 50s and 60s, who made understanding song learning in bullfinches the main topic of his research. And here he is with a bullfinch that's halfway through its training.
Zoologen Dr. Jürgen Nicolai, dann ist auf den Menschen geprägt und wird ihn einem Dompfafweibchen stets vorziehen. In dieser Zeit hat sogar einen artfremden Gesang gelernt. Balzt sein vermeintliches Weibchen mit einem Volkslied an.
This is the bird whistling. Just like a child learning a nursery rhyme, if it gets it wrong, it goes back to the beginning. And when they're on their own, these birds practice and practice and practice. They're so motivated to learn this. And you can see that this bird is completely in love with him. He's in love with the bird as well. They're both imprinted. And the amazing thing is, because it was always foresters, men, who trained these birds to sing, the bullfinches were almost always imprinted on their subsequent male owners. So often ladies would buy these birds and they'd go, doesn't sing. The husband would come in, the bullfinch would go, oh, I like you, and start singing. But you can see there's an incredible affection between the owner and the bird there, and that was the other aspect of this that made these birds so utterly charming. Well, enough of that, I'll move on. So lots of biologists have studied birdsong, partly inspired by things like that, and in today's climate, the government is looking very closely at the kind of research that they fund. And they think that things like studying birdsong is kind of frivolous research. What possible economic benefits could there be from that? But in fact, birdsong is one of the most powerful examples of why you should fund frivolous research, because the study of birdsong holds the promise of a cure for Alzheimer's. Nightingales were a complete pain in the bum to keep. They needed live food, they had wet feces, so they were very messy. When the canary came along, the canary displaced the nightingale as the cage bird. And it too, you could train it to sing all sorts of stuff. Not quite as affectionate as a bullfinch, but they were a good pet, and people still keep them today for their song. Just like the bullfinch, though, only males sing. And when in about 1940 artificial or synthetic testosterone was made, unscrupulous canary breeders got their hands on this, and they would give their female canaries a shot of testosterone. And remarkably, because females never sing, these birds would then burst into song. And it was fairly short-lived, and then when the testosterone wore off, the birds stopped singing. In the 1970s, somebody thought, this is actually pretty amazing stuff. Here's a bird that never normally sings. You give it a hormone and it can sing just as well as any male canary. What on earth is going on in the brain? And when they started looking inside the bird's brain, they discovered something that they thought just was totally impossible. So the conventional wisdom was the neurons in our brain that we're born with are the ones we will die with. That's why if you had a traffic accident and you get head injury, you've had it, basically. What happened in canaries was you gave these females a shot of testosterone and new neurons grew and allowed the bird to sing. People thought that was totally impossible. So this one frivolous study of canaries changed the whole of neurobiology, because if you can find the secret of how you make new neurons grow, then you can repair brain damage from things like Alzheimer's or even road traffic accidents. Okay, so there's a long preamble there about song. This little book also had very careful observations about migration. At that time, people thought that birds hibernated. People even thought that things like swallows spent the winter in the mud at the bottom of ponds. Here's some Swedish guys hauling a net in that's got a combination of swallows and fish. And I think that image was incredibly powerful in impressing that idea onto people's minds. You know, it's a bit like having a digital photo. I've seen the evidence. You know, it was a little woodcut from the 1550s. I know it's true that swallows hibernate in the mud. And that idea persisted through till about 1850. It took a long time to get rid of. Even our own beloved Gilbert White added fuel to this because he couldn't quite bring himself to think that swallows migrated. It took a scientist, a contemporary of Gilbert White's in Germany, to do a little experiment to demonstrate that that wasn't true. He tied coloured threads around the legs of his swallows that were breeding in his barn, and very cunningly he said, and I used a water-soluble dye, so if, when they come back next year, if that dye is gone, then that will suggest that they have indeed been in water over winter. If the colour is still there, then that will demonstrate that they haven't, and that's exactly, of course, what he found out. I'm also interested in the reproductive biology of birds. That's my main kind of research topic. And this little bird that I studied in Poland about 10 years ago was a kind of a moment that changed my life. If you look at the common garden birds that you're all familiar with, the robin, house sparrow and blackbird, and you do a molecular study on the chicks in their nest and see whether there's a mismatch, you'll find that about 10% of the offspring have been fathered by the milkman. It's exactly the same in humans, not necessarily the milkman, but 10% is the same figure. If you do that same analysis for the aquatic warbler, they have about 6 chicks on average. In half the nests that we looked at, every chick had a different dad. That's promiscuity for you. Now, in evolutionary terms, males are obsessed by maintaining their paternity, so we expect aquatic warblers to have some fantastic adaptations to secure their paternity, and indeed they do. This is a bird that I dissected. A friend of mine had them in captivity and one died. When you dissect an aquatic warbler in the breeding season, there is nothing inside a male aquatic warbler other than testes. So in birds, the testes are in the body cavity where our kidneys would be. So these are the testes, and these structures here are called the seminal glomera. They're equivalent to our epididymis, which in human males are wrapped round the testes. So these testes are huge. And just to put it in kind of human context, well, no, I'm not going to leave that. The other thing that these birds do is, I don't know if any of you have ever seen birds copulating in the garden at home, but most birds, like blackbirds and so on, copulate in 1 or 2 seconds. The aquatic warbler is a record breaker, 10,000 times that long, 35 minutes. That's pretty good going, even by human standards, I guess. It made me ask, okay, who was it that first recognised that birds have territories, breeders' pairs, and that large testes are a sure sign of female promiscuity, because males don't need those adaptations if females are not promiscuous. I wondered whether the greatest ornithologist ever might have the answer to that, and I asked my ornithological colleagues who they thought the greatest ornithologist ever was, and they came up with all sorts of names of 20th century people. And my view was that this guy, John Ray, was the greatest, not just ornithologist, but greatest naturalist ever. He really was a just incredibly clear-thinking guy. And together with his tutee, Francis Willoughby, a wealthy member of the aristocracy, they decided they were going to overhaul the whole of British natural history. Up until that time, all natural history had been based on what we can call emblematics, kind of folklore, unscientific stuff. So this little emblem here, as you can see, is a pelican piercing its own breast to feed its young on its own blood in an act of self-sacrifice. And John Ray and Francis Willoughby knew that this was twaddle and wanted to have a more scientific outlook. So they went on a grand tour, and after several years produced this book. It's called The Ornithology of Francis Willoughby because poor old Willoughby died at the age of 37 and John Ray was left to produce it on his own. And the conventional wisdom is that he named this book for Willoughby as a kind of dedication. The more realistic interpretation is that Willoughby's widow insisted on that, and Ray was kind of kept on in the house as a kind of servant, but he was an intellectual servant. So they produced this book, and it's fantastic text and fabulous drawings, engravings, except John Ray was very disappointed with the quality of illustrations that the engravers were able to come up with. They'd gone to a lot of trouble to secure good illustrations as models for the engravers. And then you got this. So you can recognise some of these. There's a tawny owl here, there's a nightjar here, this is an alpine swift. But there are these funny things here, which are from somebody else's book, from a guy called Margrave. And this bird, for 25 years, completely puzzled me. What the hell is this? Was this some kind of mythical South American bird? It's got 2 eyes. I just couldn't get my head around what's going on. I went back to Margrave's original, 1648, and it's there. You know, it's exactly the same. And then by a chance encounter, somebody told me that the painting, so what would happen on these trips is that they'd always take an artist who would do the paintings, and then the paintings would be given to the engraver who would then do this. The original paintings from this expedition were still in Brazil, in South America, and I got hold of the image that this bizarre bird here was based on, and suddenly all was revealed, and I couldn't believe how stupid I'd been. There it is, and it's a little nightjar with its beak open. Nightjars have this enormous beak for catching moths when they're flying around. And you can see how the artist must have gone, you know, who knew nothing, the engraver, who knew nothing about birds. What the hell is going on here? Okay, and that was what he did. Anyway, that's just a sideline. Now, John Ray produced another book called The Wisdom of God. And this was a kind of synthesis of all his ideas over his lifetime. And up until that point, everybody believed that God was somebody you should be frightened of. And John Ray said, no, God is a friendly guy. He's put nature there for our benefit. We shouldn't be terrified by him. And Ray called this physico-theology. It became later known as natural theology. And it was about the natural world providing evidence for the existence of God. Some people, like all new ideas, took things to extremes and they went, well, you know, here's some good evidence for the wisdom of God. God made horse shit smell sweet because he knew men would spend a lot of time working around horses. So that was, thank you God, that's great. And God also made domesticated animals very variable in their coat colour, so every man should know his own beasts. John Ray realised that that was twaddle and focused on much more important questions. Why is it that the crossbill lays its eggs in February and the bullfinch lays its eggs in May? And John Ray had the answer, because that's the time when those chicks hatch that there's most food available. Similarly, John Ray said, why is it that eagles lay 1 egg, blue tits and great tits lay 12 eggs? And again, he'd got the answer. That's the maximum number of chicks that those particular species can raise. Now, Ray interpreted all this in terms of God's wisdom, but basically he was talking about what today we call adaptation. And if you just substitute natural selection for God, Ray was an incredibly modern ornithologist. Ray was also an incredibly good scientist, because if he came across something that he couldn't understand, he didn't come up with some religious bullshit to cover up. He was completely honest. And one of the questions was, why should there be implanted in each sex such a vehement and inexpugnable appetite of copulation? Some of you may be familiar with the sensation. Ray also said, why do males produce so many sperm when only one is necessary? This seems like a very wasteful God. And he just said, I will leave that to future generations to solve. And of course, eventually, that kind of natural theology where God was the driving force gradually became replaced by natural selection and Darwin's ideas. But it's important to notice that when Darwin was a young man, that natural theology was required reading for a Cambridge undergraduate. And Darwin wrote the old argument from design in nature, that's natural theology, which formerly seemed to me to be so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. John Ray and Francis Willoughby came within a whisker of understanding this. So when they write about the European quail in their encyclopedia, the cock has great testicles for the bigness of its body, whence we may infer it is a salacious bird. Absolutely right. They have a weird mating system rather like the aquatic warbler. We now know, of course, that natural selection explains all these traits, and on the basis of what I've been saying, you might imagine that 1859 comes along, the Origin is published, all of that was kind of done and dusted in 1859, but it wasn't. It took until about 1980 for these things to be resolved. And I've puzzled about why that should be. Darwin kind of knew that some birds were promiscuous, yet he never wrote about it. And I think there are 4 reasons for that. First is Queen Victoria. With Queen Victoria looking over her shoulder at you in that kind of way, it would be a brave man that started writing about female promiscuity. Secondly, Darwin's granddad was an expert in sperm competition in his own right. He'd fathered illegitimate children all over the place. He was a doctor and prescribed vigorous sex for his female hypochondriac patients, saying, what you need, my dear, is a jolly good night out on the town or something like that. And the third was Darwin's publisher, who pleaded with him not to use the word sex in the title of his book, his second book, The Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex. John Murray said, for God's sake, just take that word out. Luckily, Darwin stuck to his guns. The fourth, and probably the most powerful influence on Darwin's reluctance to engage in this topic, were the women folk in his life, his wife, Emma, and his daughter, Etty. Now, Etty, like a lot of young people today, kind of hang about at home. And unlike a lot of young people today, she actually made herself useful. And she helped her dad do the proofs of his book. But she also acted as his censor. So if Darwin wrote something she disapproved of, she did exactly what my daughters would do and go, oh, Dad, you can't say that. You know, and she would cross it out. And we know that that's true because when Darwin wrote a little biography of his granddad, he referred to granddad's ardent love of women, meaning he was a randy old sod, and she made him take it out. And we know that that's true because we've got Darwin's original manuscript, and it's got her red crayon through it, and then there's the published version where those lines don't appear. And you get a sense of what Darwin was up against with Etty when you realise that in later life, single-handedly, she started a campaign to have one particular fungus removed from the British countryside because she thought this would be a bad influence on the maids. Now, if you or I were going to remove Phallus impudicus, is its fabulous scientific name, if you were going to remove this from the countryside, I think what you'd do is you'd walk around, you smell it first, it's called the stinkhorn, and I think I would just squash it with my foot, but Etty didn't do that. She picked them up, she handled them, and she brought them back in a basket covered in a napkin, and she burnt them in the privacy of her own study. You know, Darwin, there was no chance he was ever going to talk about promiscuity. And on that note, I'll finish.